Schneider Electric is proud to sponsor this podcast series. With a purpose to empower all to make the most of our energy and resources, our mission is to be your digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. At Schneider, we call this Life is On. Know more at se.com/au. My name is Jo Taranto and I'm joined today by Professor Peter Coombes from ANU. He's also Director at Urban Water Cycle Solutions. And today we're talking about resilience in urban water markets. Peter, thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Jo. It's great to be here.
You have had quite an illustrious and broad career in applied research. What is applied research, Peter?
Okay. Applied research is one looking at the theories and the ideas, taking all the measurements you can get, and then trying to apply your research to the real world. Real world is probably a provocative comment, but at least trying to apply your research and relate it back to measurement over time. I'm also a systems scientist, so we keep going back to what we said and comparing it to what's actually happened. So we have situations, say for Melbourne and Sydney, we've made predictions 20 years ago. We can go back and check and learn from our own mistakes and celebrate what we got right when we get it right.
In particular, you've been looking at the resilience of cities. We hear a lot about resilience, but what does it mean for you?
Oh, you could write a book about resilience. In my paper, I define resilience because if you don't do that, people have all sorts of perceptions about what resilience means. Resilience is robustness, so strength, its ability to resist. So if something's going to challenge the performance or the well-being of, say, an animal or a thing, its ability to resist that and to be robust in that response. And if that animal or thing actually does get challenged and gets set back by events, its ability to bounce back from that. So it's the restoration, the hysteresis we call it. So a really resilient system will get through shocks, as we call them, challenges, and will bounce back and return to some normal. May not be the normal from before. Pre and post-COVID is a great example of resilience of society.
And so for the resilience of cities in particular, you've been looking at cities across the world, but particularly case studies around Melbourne and Sydney. And can you tell us why you've been investigating?
I fell into Sydney because it was part of my PhD investigations, and Sydney's a very interesting city. From the diversity of its people, its topography. It's got quite a history of water management, good and bad, but it's pretty resilient. It's a premier city. I also like Melbourne as a former Melbourne boy, and it's a different sort of city, even though they're compared. And at the same time, during my PhD over 20 years ago, I started working on Melbourne as well. They're interesting for Australia because they're cities that are growing rapidly, Melbourne more rapidly than Sydney now, and overcoming these scale challenges. When cities get beyond certain threshold scales, the way they behave and are managed need to completely change at different sizes. So Melbourne and Sydney in the last decade have gone through that, 5 million people type scale. That means we need a more integrated, more systemic approach to manage the city. And it's interesting to see how they're coping with that.
And so when you're talking about the resilience of water resources within cities, what does that look like?
Well, the last 20 years, you think about it with all of Australia, but let's just take Melbourne and Sydney. They've been hit with almost every shock you could think about. What have we had? We've had heat waves, fires, droughts, pandemic, times 3 or 4 now, economic recession, even though some say it wasn't, but we've had an economic recession, We've had economic booms. We've had all sorts of things go on, variable political decisions, interesting town planning decisions, and so many other things, and a changing cultural base in terms of the demographic of both cities. And in the background, we've got virtually no real income growth with households versus very strong inflation. So there's a range of pressures going on in those cities, but cities are different everywhere. So you see a lot of reports who write averages about average Melbourne, average Sydney, but cities are different everywhere. So, and it's the sum of those differences in response to shocks that characterize the resilience of a city. So it's not the preconceived average of those people. It's what happens almost at every household, at every firm or business throughout a city. And the cities are very diverse. That's why they interest me.
So what methods do you use to understand the resilience of water resources in cities like Melbourne and Sydney?
We were big data scraping before big data was a name, and scraping was not an IT idea. So getting whatever data we can get, because most of it's not published, combining that with government reports, the regulator processes, obviously ABS and National Water Commission when we had it, we should have it, and other organisations' data that people have given me, that I've worked with. There's a huge amount of data. There's multiple layers of data that is some tiny bits of it are used, but most of it's unused. And we tend as professionals to use the bit of data that suits us. But what we're doing in systems analysis with big data is actually using all of the data and realizing there's no equation on earth that can describe the diversity of people in a city in a water system. So we don't try and write equations like we would do my first profession was an engineer, in our engineering profession. We realized those equations are unknowable. So we use all the big data in a quantum way to understand responses to all sorts of things. But that's got a framework of the hard stuff. So say the systems model of Melbourne, it's got the infrastructure networks, water, sewage, stormwater, it's got the waterways that ties it together. It's a framework. But then it's got the framework of scales, of how the different scales relate to each other, on how the people relate to each other in the different demographics and so on. So systems analysis, Donella Meadows wrote Limits to Growth with others, and working with systems just before she passed away. It's very much along those lines.
You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Professor Peter Coombes. You talk about resilience as being a system. A system, it's very hard to analyse it in just looking at one aspect. Was that challenging when you're looking at the water industry in particular to just say this is the resilience of water systems when actually resilience is a whole bunch of interconnected things?
It's always been a challenge, and after 20 years' work in 2018, a colleague of mine, Michael Barry, and I were awarded the Alexander Medal by Engineers Australia by finally convincing them that no, water systems are not about static assumptions, they're about the interaction of many things. So even if you design your water supply distribution system, it's not an average peak flow with a diurnal pattern. And that's not fixed in time forever, which is how we design. That composition of what's making that demand that's actually influencing how that piece of infrastructure works over time is completely driven, if we look at it from a systems perspective, on all the behaviours of people who are connected to that system. So if they all don't have jobs, for example, their water use would and the amount of time at home and all sorts of things can be totally different. If they all get jobs and they all become wealthy, that's completely different again. Wealthy people use a lot of water, apparently. So just that simple example I've given you shows that the engineering average assumption is not, it's good enough to design the infrastructure, but if we're really thinking about futures, we need to be considering all of the other behaviours. Sorry, long answer.
It's not a simple response.
It's not simple.
Can you tell us about what an urban water market is and what is this thing called spatial costs?
So urban water markets, from time to time, we see a paper or someone refer to it in the literature. But I'm working on it with my colleagues at ANU at the moment because I don't think we really have one at the moment. For an urban water market, take a bit of classic economics, we actually need a lot of buyers and sellers, and it's a competitive process, and because of those tensions, we get more and more products on the market and better answers, and a more literate market body. So we're and a market is best able then, with some help, of course, to respond to the challenges that are coming our way as a country. We don't have that at the moment because when we report on water, most people are only talking about utility urban water. And even in the utility space, utility urban water is not just utility urban water, it's water and sewage and stormwater services. So it's a bigger part of the water cycle. So even within the utility segment of the market, as we call it, if you're talking about water, you also need to be talking about the rest of the water services, or else it doesn't make sense. But it's broader than that. There are like 30 or 40% of water supply or water savings in the market doesn't come from utilities. So at the moment, our regulators only consider regulating the utilities, but we don't consider how our policies and our understanding of resilience best responds to an entire market with everyone that's doing water things. So that'd be a water market.
And what about spatial costs?
We charge people according to postage stamp pricing. And there's always commentary about this is the best answer. It's the most equitable answer. It's fair. It represents the costs. How could it? And it's also a taboo subject. We shall not question that. We'll move on. So we're actually questioning that, because if you're moving water from, say, Prospect Reservoir, I know you're from Sydney, to the North Shore of Sydney, it actually costs a lot of money. And then moving it back again to probably the North Head sewage treatment plant, perhaps. So that source to supply to sink can be quite costly depending on where you are and your water use habits, the age of the infrastructure, all sorts of things. So we charge people the same amount for water based on what's known as postage stamp pricing, but we actually don't have postage stamp costs. But because we have postage stamp pricing, it's assumed that the costs are the same everywhere as well, average costs, but it's not. So when your city grows and it's expanding, if you're a good manager or a prudent manager, you want to know where are the highest costs and what are the best things we can do in the places of the highest costs. So basically, it's the full costs to some future date, including what else you'll have to build to make sure your services keep happening, of supplying the services to the water cycle services to different areas across the city. And they are completely different. They vary from $2 to just under $30 a kilolitre across Sydney, which is a contentious topic.
Always contentious in Sydney. You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series, and I'm speaking with Professor Peter Coombes. With respect to water and sewage and stormwater and even waterways, how are Melbourne and Sydney different? Are they different?
They are different, but they are the same. So I thought, the dam storages in Sydney and Melbourne, they'd have to be dramatically different, right? Most people would think that. Actually not per person. They're pretty similar. So, okay. But the catchments are very different. The disposable wealth of households is completely different in Sydney versus Melbourne. And if you use a systems perspective, that means the interaction with total household water bills, everything they pay, including fixed charges and usage charges, so not just the usage charges, so it's what people see in their bills, has a different interaction with households in Melbourne and Sydney because of the different wealth of Sydney and Melbourne people. The climate's different, but not dramatically different. In the last 20 years, Melbourne people have responded very dramatically to water restrictions and saving water when they need to. And you can see it in the records. There's very substantial drawdowns of demands when they needed to in the droughts, whereas Sydney has been quite slow, quite different. So there are a number, but there's some of the ones around people. The infrastructure costs a lot more in Sydney. The spatial costs are double that of Melbourne, which is probably a topography effect as well.
And what are the insights that you've then gained about the water cycle resilience of Melbourne and Sydney?
The cities have been very resilient. In fact, the infrastructure they have is actually kicking in well above its weight compared. Both cities have had fairly enormous population growth, but their water demands for the whole city over 20 years is basically reduced. So I think Melbourne, 46% growth inside what is currently the greater Melbourne boundary, and Sydney, 26, 28% growth in the last 20 years. That's a huge growth, and using less water as a city. So that there's a bit of economic structural reform in industry happened in both areas, and we lost the manufacturing industries, and there's other things to consider. But nevertheless, the cities have been very resilient. But we might have pushed resilience as far as we can. So we have to do more things that are non-utility, like celebrating people saving water, other sources of water, rather than seeing them as competition to utilities selling water, which comes up all the time. So we're all in it together. I think this is the new normal. We need to get more out of everyone in partnership as the new threshold going forward.
So that being said, Peter, what would you suggest needs to happen from here?
We have a regulatory system that's based on an old centralised approach to water. And it's based on the value of the infrastructure that the water companies build. And that's basically it. And that's how they get to, and the amount of money they can charge customers or householders, the community, is based on how much infrastructure they build. It serves the wrong message. We need to move away from that to a more service-based regulatory model, a more market-based, dare I say it, where there's not many fixed charges. It's usage charges, variable charges. You pay for what you use. There's plenty of use. The water companies aren't going to go broke. And we need to move into a more whole of urban market mindset going forward, because we're just getting too big to continue to have this centralised approach based on valuing infrastructure.
Peter, I sense a lot of passion about this particular topic and about the industry more broadly. What are you excited about in the future?
I'm excited about where the industry is going to go, a more inclusive and broader-based future. I'm excited to see what happens, and I'm personally excited to see how it might happen, because it won't be easy, but the next steps are going to include a more diverse outcome. And I think that's going to be really interesting. It's easy for me to say here, we change the regulatory system to get what we need, but how? That's exciting. So some smart people are going to come up with those answers.
I've been speaking with Professor Peter Coombes from ANU and Director at Urban Water Cycle Solutions. Thank you for your time, Peter.
Thank you.